Good morning.
How are you? Yeah.
And good luck.
Thank you.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is my greatest pleasure to continue to chair this session. We will continue to hear intervention on biodiversity and agriculture, item 7 of SBSTTA-24. The provisional agenda, which we began yesterday. Colleagues, we are very much behind, and I therefore urge you to be very brief in your statement and stay strictly within the time limit, and please speak slowly. When we adjourned yesterday, we had the following parties on the list to speak. We had New Zealand, DRC, Russian Federation, Peru, Austria, Indonesia, Jordan, Ghana, China, and Georgia. We did our best. We will do our best to record those who have requested the floor. But if we miss any, you will have the opportunity to request the floor once I open the queue. Please do not raise your hands now. Rest assured that all parties will have an opportunity to speak. We will call on parties in the queue individually, so please raise your hand only when I call your name. I will take my first intervention from New Zealand. New Zealand, please raise your hand. New Zealand? New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. New Zealand welcomes the review of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and updated Draft Plan of Action 2020 to 2030. New Zealand is supportive of collaborative work and actions taken between the CBD and FAO and encourages further collaboration and information sharing in relevant areas throughout the development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including as it relates to soil biodiversity. For New Zealand, better understanding of our soils and protecting soil health is an important part of making sure our agriculture sectors interact positively with what we call Te Taio, our natural world. On World Soils Day last year, New Zealand's Minister of Agriculture announced a $6.25 million investment in mapping our most valuable soils through an extension of our National Soil Information System. This is aimed at ensuring farmers and land managers have robust information on their soils to help make decisions on their sustainable use. New Zealand's preliminary view is that the draft recommendation and decision can be adopted with no amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. Now, I give the mic to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Democratic Republic of Congo, please raise your hands. DRC, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Very much, Chair.
Le Seychelles, au nom du groupe.
And thank you to Seychelles for reporting on behalf of Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo thanks the CBD Secretariat for the preparation of the documents under item 7 on biodiversity and agriculture. We also thank FAO and the other organizations that we have collaborated with. The Democratic Republic of Congo attaches great importance to all issues affecting agriculture. In fact, agriculture is one of the leading sectors of the national economy. Although they are essentially small agricultural producers, rural communities account for almost all of the food production and for a significant portion of industrial crops and exports. Chair, our intervention will address first and foremost the results of the implementation review of the International Initiative, and then the summary of the report on the state of knowledge on soil biodiversity, and the draft plan of action 2020-2030. We will conclude with proposals on the suggested recommendations. Regarding the results of the review of implementation of the International Initiative, we note the following: the importance of awareness raising and transfer of knowledge of soil biodiversity to farmers, the need to mainstream soil biodiversity into sectoral policies, and the need to use NBSAPs as mechanisms to ensure this integration in national planning. Regarding the summary of the report, we note the need for more research into soil biodiversity and the pressing need to help small agricultural producers switch to organic products by making such products affordable. We suggest that the CBD send a request to IPLC to do a soil biodiversity assessment. In addition, the need for capacity building and resources in order to apply these principles of soil health and to adopt good practices for soil biodiversity improvement. Regarding the draft plan of action, we welcome this document and note that it represents a contribution to better soil management and better soil biodiversity management. Moving on to the suggested recommendations, overall, we support all of them. In addition, we ask that 3 recommendations be added. 1, increase awareness raising activities on the importance of soil biodiversity. Second, facilitate access for small-scale producers to organic products by making those products more affordable. And 3, request IPLC to do a global assessment of soil biodiversity. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Jalsi. Russian Federation, please raise your hands. Russian Federation, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Благодарю, господин председатель.
Thank you, Chair. The Russian Federation thanks the Secretariat for the deep and comprehensive review of this theme and the quality preparation of the documents under discussion, which are based on the ecosystem principle and in full accordance with the SDG targets. Our knowledge on soil is a deeply complex material that plays a crucial role in ensuring diverse ecosystem functions and food security for the people of our planet is improving with each passing year. At the same time, it has been justly noted that the current state of soil biodiversity as yet remains poorly known in many countries of the world. Standard protocols have not been developed for assessing the status and trends of soil biodiversity, including systems of indicators related to the provision of key ecosystem services. This makes it difficult to obtain a coherent and accurate picture of the status and trends of soil biodiversity change, so important for executive decision-making at various levels. While we welcome the multi-component analysis of the impact of factors threatening the preservation of soil biodiversity, we would like to draw attention to the insufficient analysis in these documents of the impacts of the mining industry. This includes the impacts that rock dumps and tailings have on the status of soil biodiversity, as well as the effects of fires and agricultural burning, a technique used widely in agriculture throughout the world. We propose that this be taken into consideration in subsequent work and in further documents. We support the initiative of ensuring that soil biodiversity is properly reflected in national reports, strategies, and action plans on biodiversity preservation, and also the proposal to introduce economic incentives for sustainable soil use practices. We consider it advisable to include a recommendation to develop national standards that foster the use of the best available technologies for farming and for restoration of damaged soils among the recommendations aimed at preserving soil biodiversity. In conclusion, we consider it important to acknowledge the role of protected areas in the preservation and recovery of soil biota. One of the founding fathers of soil science, Russian scientist Vasily Dokuchayev, initiated the creation of nature reserves in the steppes. This was a unique form of protected region where no economic activity whatsoever was allowed, which gave rise to the idea of creating natural genetic reservoirs, reference systems where the entire range of organisms, both terrestrial and subterranean, are preserved. In our opinion, the establishment of such reference areas to preserve soil biodiversity, particularly in areas of intensive cultivation, should also be incorporated in the Plan of Action 2020-2030. Thank you for your attention.
Federation. Now I give the floor to Austria, to Peru, followed by Austria and Indonesia. Distinguished delegates and speakers, please speak slowly for the benefit of the interpreters. Now I give the floor to Peru. Peru, please raise your hands. Peru, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias. Levanto la mano. Muchísimas gracias.
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me, sir? Thank you. Chair, Peru recognizes that activities to promote conservation and sustainable use of the services offered by soil biodiversity are fundamental to food security and also the achievement of more sustainable food systems to attain the Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, the Plan of Action for the Conservation and Use of Soil Biodiversity 2020 to 2030 needs to be implemented, and this will take joint work in synergy between the different sectors and actors involved. In this way, we will be able to bring about the necessary changes in agriculture and natural systems, as well as in the management policies for the land, water, and soil, which will in turn lead to more sustainable, biodiversity-friendly agricultural practices. It is recommended that the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity should be mainstreamed in the short, medium and long term into agricultural systems through good farmer practices. This can be achieved if we have efficient governance with accessible policies and regulations at different levels of government. We are also of the opinion that progress in soil research and new technologies show that we have to update land and soil management policies, and that this would lead to use of more environmentally friendly technologies and inputs, such as organic fertilizers and organic control products inter alia, which would ensure a balanced, dynamic, friendly system for the environment, the biodiversity and human beings. Chair, the commitments that will be made to implement the Plan of Action for the conservation and use of soil biodiversity 2020-2030 can only be fulfilled if the Global Environment Fund, GEF, together with other donors and funding bodies, provide technical and financial assistance for national and regional projects. Therefore, it is relevant to place emphasis on resource mobilization mechanisms under this topic. Thank you very much, Chair.
It's Peru. Now I give the floor to Austria, followed by Indonesia and Italy. Austria, please raise your hands. Austria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. We have uploaded our written submission to this agenda item in the system, so it is available for everybody. In the interest of time, I will not read out this statement, since almost all the issues we wanted to raise here have been addressed already by interventions by delegations yesterday, especially by Germany, France, Switzerland, UK, Belgium, Spain, European Union, and Portugal. But I only wanted to grasp this opportunity to congratulate the youth delegation of the Netherlands on their inspiring and optimistic statement we could listen to yesterday, and it's very good to have the youth with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Austria. Now I give the floor to Indonesia, followed by Italy and Jordan. Indonesia, please raise your hands. Indonesia, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Considering the biodiversity as part of the nature to fulfill the people's needs, Indonesia highlights the strong connection of the biodiversity and agriculture to assure the food security and existence of the people, particularly after suffering from the pandemic. In this case, the consideration of the soil and freshwater biodiversity, the pollinator, the seed, cultivated and domesticated species, and their wild-related species in their habitat is essential to fulfill the cycle of the food system. As we all may aware, the new and re-emerging disease, the climate change and the risk of natural disaster force us to find out the new and innovative and transformative change in managing land-based agriculture in line with the need of improving the quality of the products. Furthermore, Indonesia supports all efforts, including but not limited to the rehabilitation and restoration of the landscape with high biodiversity inhabitants, improve the knowledge and local wisdom, on maintain the fertilities of the soil, promoting the diversity of the local and indigenous food base to fulfill the shortage of the healthy food supplies, integrated agriculture development with other development and environment sectors and agencies. Indonesia also continues to encourage the mainstreaming of biodiversity conservation in all development sector, in domestic and also related fora in the international event, and a strong international cooperation. Finally, Indonesia calls for a global understanding and appreciation to the biodiversity as national asset for a global future generation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. Now I give the floor to Italy, followed by Jordan and China. Italy, you have the floor, and please be reminded to speak slowly for the benefit of the interpreters to make their work very much friendly and useful for those who are not speaking your language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Italy also would like to thank the Secretariat for preparing the document and the FAO for contributing to it. In line with that, the European Union and its member states had affirmed already, Italy considers the initiative crucial not only for the implementation of the post-2020 GBIF, but also for the achievements of the United Nations 2030 agenda. Italy appreciates the emphasis the document assigns the soil biodiversity component and underlines the need for implementation of policies and measures for stricter protection and more effective management of soil biodiversity. Correctly, the agricultural sector is the reference sector for this initiative, being a main driver of soil biodiversity loss. Hence, biodiversity mainstreaming aimed at protecting and restoring genetic species, soil, and landscape agrobiodiversity is fundamental, also for increasing yields and reducing wastes. However, Italy believes that this initiative on soil biodiversity must go far behind the agricultural sector. It cannot be limited to the agriculture itself and biodiversity item. Rather, it must involve every economic sector. In this regard, Italy would like to stress the fact that one of the main causes of soil biodiversity loss is soil consumption, which occurs most often at the expense of diversity-rich cropland. Also, in this case, putting the protection of agrobiodiversity at the center would help to reduce the pressures that the agricultural sector suffers from other economic sectors. And also, Italy would like to stress the fact that the significance that the document assigns to soil biodiversity is not reflected in the monitoring framework of the post-2020 GBIF in terms of consequent targets and indicators. In fact, soil biodiversity is considered now mainly in the context of agriculture and managed systems, and only through lenses of its sustainable use and not through restoration and protection actions. And finally, when referring to the European Green Deal in the text, Italy deems important to make a reference also to the two EU strategies, Farm to Fork and Biodiversity, as they provide for specific targets and measures for soil biodiversity protection and restoration. The view expressed are provisional, and Italy reserves the right to adopt them and will attach the document on the web. I thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Italy, sorry. Now I give the floor to Jordan, followed by China and Georgia. Jordan, you have the floor. Please raise your hands. You have the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس بداية نشكر.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank the Secretary for such an important document, especially when it comes to the environmental system, which is very foundational for biodiversity. In view of the conditions that the world is going through because of COVID-19, as well as the future challenges and the need for further food, we need to work hard to support the soil and its restoration and food security. These are included in the agreement to fight desertification, especially when it comes to increasing the percentage of organic carbon in the soil. Technologies used for agriculture have to be developed further to protect the change of use of land. All of this affects wildlife and natural resources. The kingdom and the king of Jordan has referred to this issue in the speech to the General Assembly last September, including the initiative that has to do with biodiversity and finding the balance between biodiversity and achieving food security. This mandate is in the hands of the UN now for whomever wishes to join it. The agreement to fight desertification and the related procedures would contribute to diminish the deterioration of land. Climate change and dryness have also to be considered into account. Change in the soil is a major factor in the deterioration. Organic agriculture is important. We need to include these in the document, as well as adding measures that would help parties to put these into their national strategies and action plans, and to look into them with deeper analysis to accomplish comprehensiveness and to ensure food security and biodiversity for humanity. Thank you.
To China, followed by Georgia and Ghana. China, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today is the Chinese Lantern Festival, so I would like to wish you a happy holiday. China welcomes the report on the state of knowledge, and it's a summary for policy makers, and supports the update of the Plan of Action 2020 and 2030. And parties should incorporate soil biodiversity into their national policies and industrial standards. and also into the ecological protection actions, so that to adopt sustainable agriculture, forestry, and soil management practices in order to address in synergy global challenges such as biodiversity loss. Parties should strengthen the management and optimal uses of the agricultural inputs such as fertilizers and pesticides in order to reduce the pressures on the environment. The 2020-2030 action plan should ensure food security and the sustainability of agricultural productivity, enable participation of farmers, balance economic and environmental benefits, and contribute to rural poverty reduction. China encourages the Secretariat to continue to cooperate with FAO and other organizations to strengthen research on it, to compile practical cases. But we think the research monitoring and sustainable management of soil biodiversity is a complex, systematic project in nailing a huge workload and high technical requirements, which may cause additional compliance burdens on developing countries. So we need to provide sufficient fund, technologies, and capacity building effort. China is willing to discuss with others to improve the draft action plan, building on our experiences, and to ensure the effective implementation of the post-2020 GBIF. Thank you.
More parties on my list from yesterday. Now I give the floor to Georgia. Georgia, please raise your hands. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Like many other countries, we would also highlight the importance of soil biodiversity and at the same time note that this issue is not yet adequately addressed compared to other topics. We would agree that the soil biodiversity should be reflected in the post-2020 frameworks and respective MBSEPs. Therefore, we welcome the review of implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, the report on state of knowledge, and the draft plan of action for 2020-2030, though we believe that it is becoming the 2021-2030 plan, with less time for implementation. We would like to thank the report by FAO regarding progress on mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sectors. We would also like to highlight the importance of soil biodiversity for development of various economic sectors, especially agricultural sector. At the same time, we would also align ourselves with the parties emphasizing importance of mainstreaming soil biodiversity in the sectors other than agriculture and forestry, including infrastructure development, mining, chemical production, waste and chemical management, urban planning. Economic research concerning dependency of various economic sectors on soil biodiversity and awareness rising on findings of the research is also of great importance. We also recognize that the initiative is implemented as a cross-cutting initiative at the global level. However, cooperation with relevant stakeholders at the national level still requires improvement, including with those already mentioned in the document, but also the units and agencies responsible for land degradation, agriculture, chemicals and waste management, environmental impact assessment, mining, and others. Finally, it should be once again emphasized that implementation of the plan, especially considering scarce data at the national level, at least in our case, will require significant financial and human resources, as well as capacity development for relevant stakeholders, including scientific institutions, which in our case tend to focus on flagship species and habitats. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Georgia. It appears that Ghana is having some technical difficulties. So this is the end of my list from yesterday. Okay, at this point, I wish to invite any party who would like to take the floor, please press and raise your hand button at the end of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list. When I give the floor, your microphone will be activated. The status bar will turn red on your computer, and you may start to speak immediately. Now I have my new list, and I will first give the floor to India, followed by FAO, and Paraguay.
Okay.
By India and Paraguay. India, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Today, all of us are very concerned about our ground situation regarding land degradation, soil health, and pollination. We all need to urgently transform our food system to ensure that they effectively contribute to biodiversity. Agriculture biodiversity provides essential ecosystem services such as conservation of our soil, water, and augmentation of soil fertility, all of which are essential for food production and for human survival and health. We need nutritious and culturally appropriate food for 7 billion people, and it is the genetic diversity of our planet's agrobiodiversity that help us to do so, along with enabling species to evolve and adapt to combat climate change impacts as well as emerging new pests and diseases, reducing our consumption and footprint, adopting sustainable lifestyle as well as sustainable land and seascape management needs to be combined with reversing nature loss and habitat restoration to ensure that we preserve the biodiversity which provides us food, livelihood, as well as well-being in the future too. India will submit its views at this physical formal Savasta meeting subsequently. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, India. Now I see the only party left on my list is Paraguay. Paraguay, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Here, Paraguay agrees that the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity is fundamental and has contributed positively to food production, improvement of the productive system and the environment. In our country, the change from the conventional production system tilling to the no-tilling system as the 90s has allowed us to increase productivity and has multiplied the production, optimized the use of resources in an efficient way through crop production, crop rotation, technological adaptation, the use of biotechnology, without having to expand the agricultural frontier nor modify soil use to the same extent. And this has allowed us to conserve forest areas. The no-tilling system is based on 3 pillars: not raking the soil, use of green fertilizers, and crop rotation. The system has brought numerous benefits to farmers, soils, the country's economy, and the environment. It has allowed us to control hydrological erosion and have more availability of rainwater for crops, more efficient use of fertilizers, availability of nutrients, reducing the rate of carbon oxidation, and has also reduced at the same time the use of plant protection products because of the agroclimate conditions in our country. These are necessary due to the proliferation of fungi and bacteria in agricultural production. The use of plant protection products, applying the best farming practices in a rational way, has harmonized production with the environment within the context of the integrated pest management strategy. Some consider that the use of agricultural lime is harmful, but according to our experience, given that tropical soils are naturally generally acid, the use of changing agents such as agricultural lime or gypsum helps to not just regulate the soil acidity, but also allows for better plant growth, and through the roots and stubble it means that crops contribute to having sufficient biomass for the soil, and it also means that we have a positive carbon balance over time. General changes in agricultural production from conventional tilling to more conservationist approach has really changed the soil management system in our country, and it means that instead of being a source of atmospheric carbon emissions, it's now an organic carbon sink. In the Americas, we have the American Confederation of Sustainable Agricultural Associations. Paraguay is a member of this through the Paraguay No-Till Federation for Sustainable Agriculture. These organizations have been working for over 30 years and have experience and measurements that could make a positive contribution to guides and encourage the use of sustainable soil management practices. So we'd like to ask the Secretariat to contact these federations as advisory bodies. Thank you very much.
Very much, Paraguay. I see no more requests from parties. We will now move on to intervention from non-parties, followed by organization, beginning with major groups. Okay, on my list, I see CBD Alliance, followed by FAO. CBD Alliance, you have the floor. Please take the floor. CBD Alliance, do we have a problem? Okay, seems we are having some difficulties with CBD Alliance. Should we move on to FAO?
So, CBD Alliance, you have the floor, please speak.
CBD Alliance, you have the floor, please speak. Go ahead. Okay, so now we move on to FAO. FAO, you have the floor. Please go ahead, FAO.
Thank you, Chair. FAO reiterates its commitment towards the sustainable management of soils, particularly the sustainable use, management, and restoration of soil biodiversity. FAO has been coordinating and providing the technical and the policy support to the successful implementation of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity. Through its Global Soil Partnership, GSP, the importance of sustainable soil management has been promoted at all levels. Soil biodiversity loss has been identified as one of the 10 major global soil threats. Following an inclusive and collaborative approach, FAO, GSP, and its partners have prepared the report State of Knowledge of Soil Biodiversity, Status, Challenges, and Potentialities. This report was launched in December 2020. The summary for policymakers has been made available to Substack. FAO, together with the CBD Secretariat, have prepared an updated plan of action for the International Initiative on Soil Biodiversity, which will be considered in the upcoming Substack meeting. The plan highlights the urgent need to scale up sustainable soil management in order to prevent soil degradation, including the further loss of soil biodiversity. Healthy soils can constitute a game changer to the global negative trends, including food insecurity, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and pollution. It's important to highlight the need to include healthy soils and soil biodiversity into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as otherwise the direct connection between above and below ground biodiversity will be ignored. In the effort to protect only above ground biodiversity will not yield the expected targets. FAO and its Global Soil Partnership are committed towards the execution of this plan and call resource partners to invest on the sustainable use and management of soils, as well as its biodiversity at national, regional, and global levels. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now, I had an error earlier on, so let me go back to the list. And I'd like to open the floor for intervention by representative of major group stakeholders. Each statement will not exceed 5 minutes. On behalf of IPLC, Romero Badzin Sotel, please raise your hands. You have the floor. You may go ahead and speak. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. ¿Me escuchan?
I'm making this statement on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. I would like to thank the Secretariat for its intense... The speaker has been lost.
Empezamos.
Wanting to express that for Indigenous peoples, the subjects of biodiversity and agriculture are based on the trilogy of Mother Earth, human beings, and the universe. These elements cover everything related to rights, ecosystem management, food sovereignty, knowledge, spirituality, and other cultural practices, and within the context of agriculture it includes traditional indigenous production systems. Therefore, when the assessment refers to soil and food security, firstly, it's restricting itself to just one aspect of these large concepts. We believe that they should be all taken into account. The cosmogonic approach of Indigenous peoples perceives the soil as a living and sacred element, an integral part of lands and territories, Indigenous traditional production models that all play part of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is a concept that transcends the food security approach. It's related to human health, recovery, and re-evaluation of traditional knowledge, and the conservation and multiplication of our seeds, and the preservation of Mother Earth. Soil health is the foundation of traditional production and also important for the development of native plants that are the basis for food sovereignty. However, when it comes to official policies and application of technological packages that promote high-yield species and monoculture and use of agrochemicals, this is causing genetic erosion and biodiversity loss in the territories of Indigenous peoples. Therefore, it is imperative to promote gene banks of traditional seeds, for example, the Cuchay Ijats, which in the Maya Cachiquel language of Guatemala means the heart of the home. This is where we're strengthening traditional, indigenous, sustainable food production systems, as well as genetic reserves of agri-food and medicinal importance that are under the governance of communities in order to achieve its self-management capacity and sovereignty. It's maintained under their custody through their own community protocols and protected by the sui generis intellectual property rights systems. Having reviewed the document CBD/SBSTTA-24/7/Rev1, Indigenous peoples recommend to the Secretariat and the parties where appropriate, that firstly, these assessments should be based on the contributions of Indigenous men and women to biodiversity and agriculture, as well as ecosystem management and traditional production collective rights systems and actions undertaken by the parties with the full and effective participation based on the vision of Indigenous peoples. Secondly, to include the subject of strengthening traditional Indigenous production systems, as well as the conservation of native plants, establishing soil classification systems that are based on traditional knowledge and practices as the model belonging to Indigenous peoples. And we should mainstream in a cosmogonic form this with the subject of land and territories, self-determination, and free, prior and informed consent processes. Thirdly, to institutionalize actions directed towards building intercultural bridges when it comes to mainstreaming NB-SAPs, as well as strengthening sustainable agriculture and protein production systems of Indigenous peoples as a resilience measure to better face climate change, contributing to enhancing the supply of food to the most vulnerable Indigenous populations in Indigenous territories. And lastly, to guarantee the sovereignty and food security and conservation of biodiversity consistent with our own models of innovation and the traditional practices of Indigenous peoples in times of pandemic. And also to set up a trust fund for Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Now I give the floor to Women's Organization, GCF. Please raise your hands. GCF, you have the floor. GCF, please press. Please give the floor to GCF. GCF, you have the floor. Please go ahead and speak. Okay. It appears that we're having some technical difficulties with GCF. So now I give the floor to GYBN. Please raise your hands, GYBN. Yes, go ahead, speak. You have the floor, GYBN.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. We welcome the enormous effort put together the report on the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity, which will be a very important tool to better understand soil biota, their ecosystem functions and services, and some of their main threats. We encourage parties to take this information into account for national strategies focused on soil biodiversity protection and management. We welcome as well the Plan of Action 2020-2030 for the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, and stress the importance of integrating the global priorities presented in this plan into the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and across relevant sectors. While we think that the plan is quite comprehensive and touches upon key issues, we also think that it could emphasize more on anthropogenic drivers of soil biodiversity loss, as the heavy and inefficient use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, land use change, fire use, crop monoculture, deforestation, overuse of agrochemicals, soil pollution, urbanization and surface sealing, deforestation and introduction of invasive alien species would need to be addressed urgently. Widespread and sustainable agriculture brings practices that degrade soil biodiversity rapidly, decreasing the soil capacity to produce and therefore promoting unsustainable agricultural expansion. Agroecological systems such as organic regenerative farming and agroforestry have the potential to ensure food security while enhancing soil biodiversity. While these kind of practices need to be supported and promoted, we see that the agro-industry still dominates the national agricultural policies all over the world, and it's more subsidized and supported by perceived incentives. Monoculture at different scales limit the presence of soil biodiversity and contributes to ecosystem degradation. It should be avoided not only in agricultural practices, but also in the ecosystem restoration attempts. When reforestation projects result in a monoculture plantation, it is our hope that the activities in the framework of the UN Date on Ecosystem Restoration don't follow these schemes. Proper soil management has the potential to improve agricultural production, find new sources of conventional and traditional medicine, increase carbon sequestration, and give us tools for biological control and bioremediation. It would have, therefore, a significant impact on our food security, health, ecosystem restoration, and climate mitigation efforts. This is why we want to encourage parties to integrate policies to promote the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity into national strategies and action plans, which will be key in the achievement of the objectives of the Convention and the Paris Agreement and the CDGs. Among these provide more funding to strengthen soil science, to support monitoring, research, and technical resources, data collection and development of national databases on soil biodiversity, and ecosystem-based approaches that conserve, restore, and avoid degradation of the soil biota. It is also very important to promote education and capacity building on soil biodiversity, and it is important in the public and private sectors, highlighting the science fact, but also the intergenerational transmission of traditional knowledge of indigenous people and local communities. Also, these policies need to be mainstream in the national agricultural policies, ensuring more support for small organic regenerative farmers, as well as more support for women and IPLCs in their sustainable agricultural soil use practices and traditional knowledge of soil management. We must overcome obstacles to adopt sustainable soil management related to land tenure and the right of users, especially women, who represent about 43% of the agricultural labor force globally, and indigenous people and local communities who are still in the struggle for the recognition of the tenure rights. We need to address soil biodiversity management from an equality perspective, respecting the visions, rights, and traditional practices of right holders involved in its conservation and sustainable use. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Adams, you are on mute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I go back to Women's Organization, Global Forest Coalition. Ms. Delgado, please raise your hands. Okay, I see no appearance from GFC. So I move on to CBD Alliance. CBD Alliance, raise your hands. CBD Alliance, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This intervention is delivered on behalf of the CBD Alliance and gathers a diverse range of views and proposals from civil society. The Plan of Action for Soil Biodiversity should put emphasis on the elimination of perverse incentives when addressing the need to remove drivers of biodiversity loss. It should also contain explicit references to agroecological and agroforestry practices, promote spatial planning as a tool to conserve soil biodiversity, and minimize or eliminate the use of all pesticide and artificial fertilizers. Forest ecosystems, agroforestry, and agroecology contribute to healthy soil biodiversity, which is reflected in the production of healthy and nutritious food. Indigenous peoples and local communities and small-scale farmers, especially women, are aware of the living nature of soil. Therefore, it is key to include their knowledge and wisdom in soil management and governance within the framework of food sovereignty by recognizing, supporting, and securing the traditional ecosystems and agricultural practices and their rights. It is not a matter of transferring knowledge to farmers or IPLCs, but more so of learning from their long-standing knowledge, innovations and practices, and co-creating solutions with them rather than imposing those upon them. We should particularly foster the traditional knowledge of women in this respect. We need to ensure that the use of new technologies such as molecular sequencing techniques and big data, artificial intelligence, and novel metagenomics do not adversely affect human knowledge and relationships with the soil biodiversity of a particular territory. Industrial agriculture, especially monocultures for livestock feed and deforestation for livestock grazing, have severe consequences for soil fertility and biodiversity. Subsidies and investments must be redirected towards agroecological solutions and regenerative agriculture which supports biodiversity, including agricultural biodiversity, in all its forms and at all levels. These must be addressed in the currently proposed targets 1, 6, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 in the GBIF. We question the framing of targets 8 and 9 and the suggested indicators which could exacerbate current trends by encouraging intensive farming practices which may reduce productivity gaps but harm biodiversity. Further, indicator 9 and 1 is limited. Clarification is needed to define what is meant by sustainable agriculture and that this is agriculture which contributes to biodiversity. It is also important to promote practices such as crop diversification, no-till farming without herbicides, integrated fertilizers and pest management, erosion minimizing irrigation technologies, crop rotations, permaculture, and agroforestry, all of which have been practiced in indigenous farming systems and by small-scale food producers. A recent report by UNEP and others made it clear that feeding the world's population without destroying biodiversity is not possible without a significant reduction in the consumption of meat and dairy from intensive livestock production systems. Because animal farming occupies 78% of agricultural land, while providing only 18% of global calorie supply and 37% of global protein supply. An immediate phase-out of all perverse incentives and investments that promote unsustainable livestock production and monocultures for producing the food is indispensable. The report also highlights that more balanced diets, biodiversity conservation, and supporting agroecology are mutually reinforcing strategies that cannot be implemented in isolation from each other. Finally, we warn against the inclusion of language not yet defined under the CBD, which as nature-based solutions that can potentially open doors for mitigation pathways such as large-scale afforestation that are neither natural nor solutions and distract from true transformative actions. The CBD has its own well-defined terminology, ecosystem approach, and ecosystem-based approaches, and should continue to use these rather than adopting new, sweeping, hard-to-define terminology. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now I'll try again. Women's Organization, GFC. Raise your hands. You have the floor.
Thanks, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Thanks, Chair, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I will speak on behalf of Women's Caucus. The report on the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity and the FAO report on the progress on mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sector did not adopt a systemic and gender-responsive approach in their analysis. We feel that it is a lost opportunity to bring in and ensure the mainstreaming of gender concern throughout the program and work of the convention. Therefore, if decision-making process as well as studies linked to agriculture and biodiversity are not gender responsive, nor recognize the unique role of women in agriculture, not only do they risk overlooking women's specific needs and roles, but they will also fail to ensure the inclusion of valuable knowledge important for enabling sustainable soil biodiversity practices. First of all, we need to acknowledge the the soil is a living organism made up of millions of diverse organisms. This biodiversity is the basis of a healthy and productive soil, which is, in the meantime, is reflected in the production of healthy and nutritious food. Indigenous people, especially women, are aware of this living nature of soil, as they name the soil as Mother Earth can reflect it. They are also aware of the interdependency of the soil biodiversity with other living ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, and agroecological practices. Therefore, it's key to include indigenous peoples and women's knowledge and wisdom in the management and recovery of soil biodiversity damaged by industrial and monocrop farming because of the indiscriminate use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which kill the soil biodiversity. As all of us know, industrial and monocrop farming sustains the present global food system, and the concentration of economic power.
GFC, sorry for your interruption. We have a problem with the interpretation. So we have no interpretation. So I'll take it back to the Secretariat to just resolve this problem.
Should I wait or should I follow?
JFC, unfortunately, the problem is that the quality of your sound is not good. So it's very difficult for interpreters to listen and provide interpretation. So we can go ahead. You can try probably to fix your connection and maybe microphone. And we can try again after we go with the list of NGOs.
Okay. Maybe you can hear me a bit better now. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Try this.
Then I will continue, or I will start from the beginning. What is your advice?
Please try to sum up as time is running. Yeah.
Okay. As all of us know, industrial and monocrop farming sustains the present global food systems and the concentration of economic power in the hands of agri-multinationals. The report of IPES on biodiversity and ecosystem service exposes the role of the global food system as the principal drivers of accelerating biodiversity loss and explain how food production is degrading or destroying living ecosystems, contributing to a species extinction. Without reform of our food system, biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate, threatening our ability to provide healthy food to human population. Achieved to a more balanced diet has to be based on support of agroecological practice instead of support to industrial fake meat and dairy production. Currently, 78% of agricultural land is used for meat and dairy production, while it produces only 80% of the global calorie supply and 37% of global protein supply, most of which is currently consumed by wealthy elites in society, with men consuming significantly higher amounts of meat than women. Industrial monocrop farming practices pose a significant risk to biodiversity and healthy ecosystem and humans' health and well-being.
I'm sorry.
Stemming from the
problem. So the quality of your sound is not good for interpretation.
Sorry for that. Sorry for that.
But we understand that your statement is available and you submitted your statement, so then definitely statement is in a public domain. So we also can invite participants to have a look at your statement.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, GFC. Thank you very much, Secretariat. I will now open the floor for intervention from other observers. Now I give the floor to GBIF, GBIF. GBIF, you have the floor. Please raise your hands. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm making this intervention on behalf of GEO BON and GBIF. Soils harbour immense biological diversity, which is of incalculable value for sustaining life on Earth. Yet little is known about the conservation status of most soil organisms and the effects of nature conservation policies on soil systems. The FAO State of Knowledge report highlights the need for complementary initiatives to overcome the current geographic, taxonomic, and other data gaps that persist in our understanding of the world's soils. Through the Global Soil Biodiversity Observation Network, or SoilBON, GeoBon and GBIF have agreed to join forces to contribute to monitoring and mobilization of data for soil biodiversity and ecosystem services. Tens of thousands of soil biodiversity data records have already been mobilized through GBIF using global standards and open data principles. But this initiative and others like it depend on
GBIF, we're having some problems hearing you. All right, so we're experiencing some technical difficulties with GBIF. We will come back to GBIF. Now I give the floor to ABC. ABC, you have the floor.
And systematize actionable knowledge with the purpose of directly contributing to targets and indicators established through the Global Biodiversity Framework, both at national and global scales. We therefore welcome the proposal and the draft decision to adopt the Plan of Action on Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity and urge parties to join our efforts through their national participation in GeoBon and in GBIF, and also through direct contribution and reporting to forthcoming monitoring and data mobilization campaigns on soil biodiversity, as suggested in Annex 2 of the document. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, GBIF. Now I give the floor to ABC, followed by Pronatura FOE Suites and AVAAZ. ABC, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Chair. We are making this intervention from civil society organizations in Africa, representing millions of small-scale farmers across the continent. We would like to make 4 main points as it affects the interface between agriculture and biodiversity. First, industrial agriculture in Africa is built upon gross inequalities and social exclusion and has benefited primarily the corporate sector, while hunger and malnutrition are continuously on the rise. This moment demands that we face hard geopolitical and inherently neo-colonial underpinnings that structure Africa's relationship with the rest of the world, and which are primarily responsible for driving the economic, ecological, and health crises on the continent. Second, we are deeply concerned that despite the incredibly harmful impact of industrial agriculture and food supply chains on biodiversity, we are witnessing an indiscriminate promotion of industrial agriculture, worryingly made by a number of parties in their interventions, which is nothing but a throwback to Africa's colonial past, deepening our crises and will keep us indebted and resource poor. This will not only marginalize smallholder food producers who in fact feed the continent, but worse still, precipitate more dispossession, poverty, social exclusion, and conflict. Third, Africa needs to be forward-looking and claim its rightful place towards a uniquely African food sovereignty program and a greater focus on socially just and ecologically sustainable intra-regional trade. We cannot continue to be captured by global supply chains controlled by corporate giants, and here we highlight some key concerns in regard to industrial agriculture's adverse impacts on biodiversity. Industrial agricultural production models are constituted by monoculture production of primarily export-oriented crops, which increase crop vulnerability and genetic erosion and limits the biodiversity on farms significantly, and increases the overall vulnerability of food systems both nationally and regionally. The dramatic reduction of crop diversity has significant negative impacts on local food and nutritional security. Soil biodiversity is the very basis of healthy soils, which provide many ecosystem functions, supporting resilient agriculture, livelihoods, etc., and this is threatened by industrial agricultural practices which result in soil erosion, infertility, harm soil biodiversity, as well as degrades and pollutes upstream and downstream ecological and human health. While soil is crucial for the future of food, as well as providing the essential ecological base for human survival, we are deeply concerned with the narrow focus on soil biodiversity and soil as a tool for carbon sequestration and carbon trading. We caution that such a perspective fails to take into account the systemic issues causing the climatic and ecological crisis globally. We urgently need to transition towards biodiverse agroecological systems, as these directly contribute to ecosystem restoration, enhance soil fertility and agronomic performance, maintains and conserves both on and off-farm biodiversity, and has enormous potential to contribute to economic and food sovereignty for the African region, including job creation in both rural and urban areas. In conclusion, the global biodiversity community must debunk the outdated fallacy of industrial agriculture and has an obligation to ensure a deep and scientific and socioeconomic discourse to be established on the multiple linkages between agriculture and biodiversity. And this includes confronting and redressing laws, policies, programs, agreements, and financial flows which promote the wholesale destruction of Africa's seed, food and ecological systems and the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now, due to time constraint, we will only take 3 more interventions and end this agenda item. And I take the first intervention from Pronatura, followed by AVAZ and SPREP. Pronatura, you have the floor. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can go ahead.
So this statement is on behalf of Pronatura, Friends of the Earth Switzerland, and Friends of the Earth Europe. Before we comment on the substance draft on soil biodiversity and adopting the draft plan of action contained in Annex 2 of that draft decision, SBSTTA-24, we would like to stress that soils are the result of long-term processes and need centuries to evolve and develop their full potential. It is therefore of utmost importance to conserve and widely use this precious resource. Friends of the Earth Europe fully associates itself with the statements on behalf of the CBD Alliance. However, we would like to emphasize a number of important points which are contained in the report of the European expert meeting in preparation of SBSTTA-24. This report suggests a number of improvements to document 24/7, which we particularly would like to highlight. Firstly, we agree with parties that the open-ended working group should take soil biodiversity into account when adopting the new targets, and this is suggested in the report as a paragraph 2 bis. Secondly, we do think it is important to adopt and welcome this plan, as already stated in the draft COP decision. Thirdly, we think it is important to add and specify the elimination of perverse incentives when addressing the need to remove drivers, suggested as addendums to paragraph 4 of the draft COP decision and point 1.6 of the plan of action. Fourthly, we suggest to mention agri-ecological and agroforestry practices in Annex 2, element 1.4, as a way to conserve and sustainably use soil biodiversity. Fifthly, this report suggests to promote spatial planning as a tool to conserve soil biodiversity and reduce soil sealing as a new 1.12 of the annex. Sixth, most importantly, minimize the use of all pesticides and organic and artificial fertilizers and bring them to levels that do not exceed critical loads. This is really the key problem for agrobiodiversity in many industrialized countries, and fertilizers are not mentioned in the annex yet at all. So we suggest to have an addition in 2.1 on ways to improve soil health. And lastly, there is a suggestion to encourage landscape features like hedgerows and terraces. This would be an insertion to Annex point 2.4. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Pronatura. Now we take intervention from AVAZ, followed by SPREP. You have the floor. Please go ahead and speak. AVAAZ. Please go ahead.
Abbas, you have the floor. Go ahead.
To the video statement that we sent earlier ago.
Okay, we are apparently having some with Abbas. So now I give the floor to SP.
With delegates and observers. The time has come to move beyond the zero draft for informal discussions and meet the urgency of the 0 hour of this time. What we need to do. Renewing targets and scopes should be about doing what has not yet been done. In situ conservation is a major element not only to maintain the essence of sustainable food systems, but to tackle biodiversity loss, climate change, and desertification and land degradation as well. In situ conservation has been done by indigenous peoples and local communities for thousands of years. That's why they must be part of planning, designing, discussing, negotiating, and agreeing on the protection, conservation, and restoration of productive areas, on the sustainable use of biodiversity and its mainstreaming to agricultural sectors, and on any global framework to be designed, including the Global Biodiversity Framework. Only this will make their participation full and effective. This is doing things differently. The vast citizen plan, drawn up from active listening, especially since the pandemic was declared, is built on these and other major changes which all know are needed. 66 million Avast members are demanding these changes. We urge distinguished delegates and observers to listen, as we, the people, are done with talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Abbas. Now we take the last speaker for unless item 7, and I now give the floor to SPREP. Please take the floor.
Thank you. The Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Programme note the review of the implementation of the International Initiative and welcome the draft plan of action. The Pacific Islands, especially the atoll nations, contain some of the most vulnerable soil systems in the world. While some of the drivers of soil biodiversity loss can be managed, other drivers are beyond the control of individual island nations. The legacy of nuclear testing, as well as climate change and associated implications, including sea level rise and extreme events, are having significant impacts as key drivers of soil biodiversity loss, which cannot be easily managed at a country level. We also recognise the strong links between soil biodiversity and coastal and marine ecosystem health, which is of great importance and relevance for the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands rely heavily on the essential services provided by soils, but are particularly vulnerable to soil biodiversity loss, have limited capacity and significant challenges and gaps in expertise, data and information relating to soil biodiversity. SPREP therefore support the recommendation inviting donors and funding agencies to provide financial assistance for national and regional projects that address the implementation of the plan of action, including supporting mainstreaming across sectors, awareness raising and capacity building, and supporting the incorporation of soil biodiversity management into national biodiversity strategies and other cross-sectoral plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this, we close the floor for this agenda item due to time constraints. So please submit your presentation And as you know, there will be no conference room people stemming out from this informal session. Together with the chair of SABSTA, the Secretariat will prepare a short procedural report on this informal session, noting the parties and the observers that have made intervention. Colleagues, we will now take a 5 minutes break. Please remain connected. There will and do not log off. So we will take a 5 minutes break, a 15 minutes break. 15 minutes break. So we shall return approximately at 9:40, 9:43 by my time. So please do not go anywhere.
8:35 Montreal time.
Oh, 8:45. Okay. All right. Great. And after this, we will deal with agenda item 10 on invasive alien species in a session chaired by my colleague on the SABSA Bureau, Ms. Helena Brown of Antigua and Barbuda. I thank the chair and my colleagues in the SABSA Bureau for giving me this opportunity to chair this session, and I thank you very much for your cooperation, and do enjoy the rest of your break and the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adams. Great chairmanship. So see you in 15 minutes with Helena to continue with invasive species. Bye-bye.
Dear colleagues, I am very pleased to chair our consideration of item 10 of the SBSTTA-24 Provisional Agenda, Invasive Alien Species. I will now give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On item 10, the Secretariat has prepared document SBSTTA-24/10 invasive alien species with a corrigendum SBSTTA-24/10/core1 pursuant to decision 14/11. The document contains 5 annexes and a report on the progress on classification and labeling on the consignment of living organisms. The subsidiary body will be invited to consider the annexes and provide advice and recommendations to the Conference of the Parties at its 15th meeting as appropriate. In addition, the subsidiary body has before it 3 information documents related to this agenda item as shown in the slide. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. I now open the floor for interventions on item 10, invasive alien species, starting with regional groups, followed by parties and then observers. I will take the first intervention from the African region. African region, South Africa. You have the floor. Please press the raise your hand button to be given the floor. Okay, I am not seeing Africa at this time, so I will move on to Central and Eastern European region. Georgia, you have the floor. Georgia, you may begin speaking.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Я надеюсь, вы меня слышите.
Chair, I hope that you can hear me well. On behalf of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, let me first of all thank the Secretariat for its hard work, as well as for organizing and supporting extremely important processes, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The result has been the preparation of important and necessary guidelines and other documents, including those on invasive alien species. We also thank all those involved in these processes, including the ad hoc technical expert group on invasive alien species, for their important work. We recognize the serious threat that invasive alien species pose to biodiversity, and we share the need to address this threat. Therefore, we welcome the implementation of the proposed methods, results, and recommendations to achieve these goals. We appreciate the documents prepared by the ad hoc technical expert group on invasive alien species, presented as an annex, and we share the views and recommendations expressed therein, including on the actions to be taken. These documents cover a multitude of areas and ambitious targets, which can only be welcomed. Nevertheless, the implementation of the proposals is a long-term process, and we believe that further concrete actions should be scheduled and prioritized in the future, also taking into account different global processes, such as climate change. We would also like to draw attention to various difficulties and restrictions, such as limited financial and other resources, and the need for capacity building, which countries, especially developing countries and countries with economies in transition, will face. The document presented by the expert group in Annex 5 indicates the need for capacity building, resource mobilization, and information exchange for the invasive alien species risk assessment and risk management through international assistance programs. Also, it indicates the need to strengthen the capacities of countries, allocate the necessary resources to implement existing international guidelines and standards of the International Plant Protection Convention, and develop national regulatory frameworks to address the risks of invasive alien species. But all of the aforementioned aspects are recommended for developing countries. Therefore, we consider it important to emphasize this need in the proposed recommendations on invasive alien species, including the decision to be taken at the 15th session of the Conference of the Parties, as well as in the annexes, not only for developing countries, but also for countries with economies in transition. We also believe that the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including the dimension of invasive alien species, requires robust and systematic means of implementation. Therefore, these aspects need to be taken into account in donor funding priorities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Central Eastern European. Now we'll try with South Africa, representing the African region. South Africa, please, you may speak. Thank you. South Africa, we can't hear you at this time. May I suggest that we get a, can you speak now? Hello? I'm not hearing you very well at all. Yeah, your connection is not good at all. We cannot hear you. I'm going to ask that you perhaps get somebody to give the speech. Okay, yes, I can see that your connection is better. Can we give South Africa the floor again, please? South Africa? May we give South Africa the floor, please? I'm not seeing, okay, I'm not seeing them anymore. Okay, so we will come back to you, South Africa. At this time, I will now open the floor for interventions by parties. If you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list. When I give you the floor, your microphone will be activated, the status bar will turn red on your computer, and you may start to speak immediately. So now I will first take the intervention from Germany, followed by Belgium, and then Portugal. Germany, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Germany believes that biological invasions are a very important threat to biodiversity, and we are convinced that many of the challenges related to invasive alien species can only be solved at the global level. Germany would therefore like to thank the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group on Invasive Alien Species for its work and the Secretariat for the preparation of document CBD SBSTTA-24/10 on invasive alien species. We strongly agree that the guidance on the issues covered by the document will be very helpful on the path of tackling biological invasions globally. As many other countries, we are highly worried by the amount of species still being traded via e-commerce. We are equally alarmed that climate and land use change will further accelerate species invasion. These and other challenges need to be addressed by the international community. However, we believe that especially the guidance contained in the annexes needs to be further improved before the annexes can be endorsed, because some of the recommendations in the annexes are not in line with or even contradictory to former COP decisions, and many of the recommendations in the annexes are rather lengthy and complicated. They do provide some important pieces of information, but not in all cases a summary that is useful for decision makers. Germany will hand in some proposals for improvements in the draft recommendation and the annexes in writing. However, further improvements of the annexes will be necessary before they can be endorsed. If it is not possible to complete this revision during SBSTTA, we would like to ask the Executive Secretary to facilitate an additional process that aims at further improving the annexes before COP15. Taking into account the current predictions that species invasions will pose even more serious threats in the future, we do hope that the revision of the document and the annexes will be successful, and that strong and clear recommendations will be developed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Germany. We will now have Belgium, followed by Portugal and Spain. Belgium, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Belgium thanks you and the Secretariat for the documents. Concerned as we are by the growing number of invasive alien species causing harm to biodiversity, human health and society, we invite the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to take into account the significance of the negative impacts of invasive alien species on biodiversity when developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. On the outcome of the work of the ARTEC, as reflected in the annexes to the pre-session documents, we, as with the previous speaker, have several issues. We note that there is a discrepancy between some of the titles and the content of the annexes, and these do not seem to correspond with the requests contained in the terms of reference of the ARTEC, while one annex has no counterpart in the terms of reference. Hence, we are left wondering whether the ARTEC process has fully respected its mandate as reflected in the terms of reference. In particular, we couldn't find back advice or elements of technical guidance on methods for cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis which best apply to the management of invasive alien species in Annex 1. We note that a number of valuable elements from the ARTEC report have not been retained in the annexes. And finally, several elements contained in the annexes are similar but differently worded from earlier COP decisions. Belgium is therefore not in a position to endorse the annexes in their present state. Belgium welcomes the work on the classification and labeling for consignments of living organisms that pose a hazard or risk to biological diversity relating to invasive alien species in response to paragraph 13A of Decision 14/11, and we support the suggested corresponding recommendation. Please note that the views expressed here are provisional and Belgium reserves the right to adopt them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Belgium. We will now have Portugal, followed by Spain, and then Chile.
Distinguished delegates, acknowledging the critical importance of tackling the impacts of IES, Portugal welcomes the work undertaken by the Interagency Liaison Group on IES and by the World Customs Organization to address the risk of living organisms as environmentally hazardous goods in transport and cross-border e-commerce, and therefore highlights the need to take into account the importance of IAS in the work of the post-2020 GBIF, recognizing their role in the loss of biodiversity and establishing adequate targets and indicators to tackle those impacts. The importance of applying the precautionary approach with regards to the potential use of engineered gene drives for the management of IAS. The need to develop open access portals and other means to inform stakeholders, decision makers, policymakers, and general public about the environment and socio-economic impact of IAS and involve them in actions towards preventing, early detecting, and controlling invasions. The role of invasive alien species in the transmission of diseases affecting biodiversity as well as human health. Portugal encouraged SBSTTA to send a recommendation to COP15 about the urgency in adopting a decision concerning the outcomes of the ad hoc technical expert group, especially in what concerns to the definition of methods for cost benefit and cost effectiveness analysis, which best apply to the management of IAS, the definition of methods, tools, and measures for the identification and mitigation of additional risks associated with cross-border e-commerce in live organisms, as well as strategies for the management of IAS as it related to the prevention of potential risks arising from climate change and associated natural disaster and land use changes, the development of risk analysis procedures on the potential consequences of the introduction on IAS on social, including health, economic, and cultural values, the use of existing databases on IAS and their impact to support risk communication. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Portugal. We will now have Spain and then Chile, followed by Brazil. Spain, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Very much, Madam Chair. The IPBES Global Assessment on Biodiversity identifies IAS as one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, as well as causing serious economic and social problems. Given the serious nature of this issue, we urgently need to continue to adopt measures to prevent, control, and possibly eradicate invasive alien species. This is especially essential. We need to make a big effort with preventative measures. Therefore, Spain welcomes the results of the ATEG and considers that the guidance found in the annexes to the SBSTTA recommendation, with the appropriate improvements prior to its adoption by COP15, will allow parties to improve their actions to counter the increasing threat posed by IAS. So with regard to guidance found in the annexes, Spain wishes to highlight two measures of particular interest. Firstly, in Annex 2, there's the suggestion that the states consider the use of lists that specify which species may be imported and restrict the remainder, rather than lists that only identify those species whose import is prohibited or restricted. Using these lists for trade matters will mark an important step forward in preventing the introduction of exotic species that could become potentially invasive. Currently, if a species is prohibited, traders then promptly identify another or several other similar species whose problematic aspects may not generally have been assessed. In this way, regulations are always following behind the market, whereas it should be the other way around, ideally. Secondly, in Annex 5, we appreciate the call to the CBD Secretariat to collaborate with the World Tourism Organization to address tourism as one of the pathways for introduction of IAS. This is a necessary measure and it's an important example of mainstreaming biodiversity and should be able to be replicated by other international sectorial organizations and in many other spheres over and above IAS alone. SBSTTA-24 recommendation has to convey the urgency of addressing the important and growing problem of IAS. This should be reflected in a target aimed at specific action that is measurable and very ambitious within the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020, so that by 2030 this serious problem will have been contained and its effects will have been reduced. Therefore, we believe it's necessary that the Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should take account of the discussions during SBSTTA-24 and fully integrate the references to IAS into this Post-2020 framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Spain. And to all parties, please be reminded to speak slowly so that our interpreters are able to pick up everything. Thank you. So now we will have Chile, followed by Brazil, and then Morocco. Chile, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
We would like to make the following preliminary remarks on the topic of IAS. Firstly, as regards import or restricted lists, our country supports the use of lists to authorise which species can enter the country and that restricts the import of the remainder. We also believe that we need to urge parties more vehemently to respect, enhance, and identify ways to reduce imports and the introduction of these exogenous species and improve early detection thereof. Turning to tourism, Chile considers that this activity should take more of a preventive rather than a reactive approach to IAS. It is not enough to simply focus on minimising the impact of touristic activity. We actually need to make tools available with a proven track record in the control and eradication of these species. Chile is a member of the World Customs Organization and party to the International Convention on the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System. Therefore, we are aligned with the proposal for a globally harmonized system for consignments of environmentally hazardous living organisms. However, we believe that we need more clarity on the definition, content, and scope of this last concept. We also believe that there needs to be an enhanced reference and integration of biosecurity barriers on this topic. Finally, on the IAS-related aspects, as under other topics, we are requesting the inclusion of aquatic, marine and island ecosystems, as well as the inclusion of the concept of changing sea use. Also, it seems appropriate to us to strengthen work on the correct implementation of mechanisms to prevent, manage and reduce the impact of IAS on aquatic, marine and island ecosystems. Madam Chair, these are our general comments on this subject, and at the correct moment in time we will submit all of the details, suggestions and relevant proposals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chile. We will now have Brazil, followed by Morocco, and then Finland. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll present some preliminary comments related to the topic of invasive alien species. The official position will be presented at the next formal face-to-face SBSTTA meeting. Brazil has engaged constructively in the last COP towards a decision that would assess the relation between trade and the threat of invasive species. Even though trade is not part of the CBD mandate, we agree with the value of exploring the topic. For instance, in Brazil, we are developing a set of actions within our national strategy on invasive species to address the risks associated with e-commerce. Our goal is to reach a balanced solution, one that does not create excessive burden to trade and at the same time allow us to monitor and control the entry of invasive species in the territory. However, the focus of the current SBSTTA documents under this topic goes beyond presenting an overview of the impact of trade and propose very specific trade measures, such as labeling. Decision 14/11, in its paragraph 13, underlines that all measures under consideration should be consistent and in harmony with international agreements. The same paragraph also makes it clear that the evaluation of a possible labeling system should be in line with international standards. Considering that labeling is an area extensively regulated by GATT, we were surprised not to see representatives of the WTO taking part of the ad hoc technical expert group meeting. We are also puzzled by the fact that the 2019 meeting of the Interagency Liaison Group on Invasive Species also did not involve any WTO expert. Most of the recommendations contained in the annexes to the report are already in place either under the standards of the International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC, or the World Animal Health Organization, OIE. To address the mandate of Decision 14/11, the ATAG, together with the liaison group, could make a compilation of these standards. Finally, we would recommend caution when addressing cultural values in the context of risk analysis, since cultural values are not recognized as valid criteria by either the IPPC or OIE. Moreover, WTO SPS agreements specifically discourage measures that are not based on science or aligned with international standards, guidelines, and recommendations developed by the Codex Alimentarius, IPPC, or OIE. In the light of the above, Brazil is not able at the moment to welcome the recommendations arising from the report of the ATAG on invasive species, nor the request to the Secretariat to submit a proposal on labeling. We look forward to contributing to further discussions on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. We will now have Morocco, followed by Finland and then Sweden. Morocco, you have the floor. Thank you. Morocco, please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Chair, can you hear me? Thank you. Hello, dear delegates. Morocco takes note of document CBD SBSTTA-24/10 and its multiple annexes, as well as the results of the ATEG's work on invasive alien species. Morocco supports the statement made on behalf of the African group and welcomes the spirit of that statement. We have taken note of the elements addressed by the ATEG, the group, or the technical expert group, and the related advice on supplementary guidance concerning the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, management of specific incursion vectors, progress on the classification and labeling of shipments of living organisms, as well as the ways of preventing unintentional introduction of invasive alien species through trade. Nevertheless, there is a large volume of guidance, and it would certainly be helpful to have the guidance simplified and supported with case studies and examples of best practices in order to allow effective mainstreaming at the national level. Indeed, Morocco believes it very important to insist on support mechanisms for updating national strategies on invasive alien species and on the need for capacity building for national institutions in charge of these activities. They require means of identifying invasive alien species, preventing their introduction, eradicating and effectively managing those that have already been introduced. They also need capacity building for development of an updated and, most importantly, appropriate legal arsenal in this area. Regarding border controls over the transfer of invasive alien species, it is important to pursue efforts to harmonize labeling at the international level for trans-border shipments of living species that could have potentially dangerous consequences for biodiversity and the environment in general. This also involves training for border service officers and capacity building for the border services themselves, particularly within customs and forestry administrations. This also applies to those responsible for the protection of plants and animal health. Enforcement of border controls, together with those taken at a national level under CITES, would make it possible to achieve an undeniable synergetic effect. Finally, awareness raising on the dangers, economic, environmental, and sanitary dangers represented by invasive species remains an action of prime importance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Morocco, we will now have Finland, followed by Sweden, and then the UK. Finland, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, we need decisive actions to combat the threat of invasive alien species. Firstly, when developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, Finland calls for that a clear linkage to the negative impacts of invasive alien species on biodiversity is made in the GBIF. Finland would like to see that this point is reflected in the suggested recommendations of the SBSTTA. Secondly, awareness raising and understanding the threats of invasive alien species on biodiversity are key issues for combating the threats. We want to underline the need to develop open access portals or other websites to inform and involve also the general public to address invasive alien species. For this, Finland proposes a new para in the recommendations to the COP. Thirdly, we are happy to note that measures to reduce the risks of invasive alien species introduced by e-commerce through internet are progressing. From the global point of view, further work is still needed, and for this and other points to be further developed. Finland highlights that the content of the annexes of the document would still need revision before they are endorsed. We would like to see that the time is used efficiently before the formal substa and that the annexes are given the attention they need. Finally, also IPBES work on invasive alien species now underway needs to be carefully studied and taken into account in the implementation work of the post-2020. Finland supports the interventions made by Portugal and all the other European Union colleagues under this agenda item. We will submit our written amendments to the recommendation to the Secretariat. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Finland. We will now have Sweden, followed by UK and then Mexico. Sweden, the floor is yours.
Sweden supports the statements of the European Commission, Portugal, Finland, and other European countries. Although we appreciate the elements of guidance in the substa documents, we cannot endorse the annexes as presented, as there are some serious issues that should be addressed before endorsement. Therefore, we request that the annexes be revised before the formal substa if possible. In the recommendations, we introduce a chapeau paragraph to clarify that previous decisions and voluntary guidance on invasive alien species in live trade may also apply to alien species in e-commerce. Sweden would like to introduce 3 recommendations developed together with the IUCN Invasive Species Specialist Group to address the impact on biological diversity of emerging infectious diseases that are spread or vectored by invasive alien species or are alien pathogens or parasites. We also introduce a recommendation reaffirming that the precautionary approach should be applied when considering using engineered gene drives for management of invasive alien species. We also request parties and others to monitor the effects of large-scale releases of alien translocated or captively raised populations on native populations and to undertake actions to address their detrimental effects. We thank the Secretariat for its excellent work with implementing COP decisions to develop harmonized standards for labeling consignments of living organisms that could cause harm to biodiversity, and encourage the Secretariat to continue with this work. Finally, we thank the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation for organizing the Vilna meeting and request that substa considers the amendments regarding invasive alien species recommendations contained in the Vilna report. Thank you.
Thank you, Sweden. We will now have UK, followed by Mexico and Canada. UK, you have the floor. UK, we can't hear you. Try again, please. UK, you have
Can you
the
hear
floor.
me now?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The United Kingdom is very supportive of continued and increased action on invasive alien species. We recognize the growing threat that they pose to the UK's environment and its overseas territories, many of which are small islands, which face particularly acute invasive alien species threats. The UK is very active in many areas, including on invasive alien species risk assessment and risk management, rapid responses, and specialist control of species. We are also working to strengthen our overall biosecurity approach, forging greater integration between alien species, invasive alien species, and plant, animal, and human health. Regarding CBD/SBSTTA-24/10, the UK welcomes the work and conclusions of the ad hoc technical expert group, including the additional recommendations in Annex 5. We further welcome the work of the Secretariat on the classification of invasive alien species and the inclusion of invasive alien species in the technical specifications related to e-commerce. We note that there have been numerous decisions on invasive alien species over the years, and we need to ensure that these are reflected in this document. We support the reference to Decision 12/17, which noted the strong interlinkages between invasive alien species and infectious diseases. We believe it's vital to forge closer links with plant, animal and human health institutions to pursue a One Health approach to biosecurity, which would put invasive alien species more on a par in terms of biosecurity response. Overall, while we need to maintain momentum on invasive alien species actions at CBD, we also need to ensure that any future work proposed does not duplicate work being done to invasive alien assessment due in 2023. Accordingly, we support the requests for the future work for the Secretariat, particularly and 7C on enhanced.
UK, we have lost you. It seems that the quality of your sound is not good, and we've lost you altogether. Okay, so in the meantime, we will go to South Africa, who will speak on behalf of the African region. South Africa, please raise your hand. South Africa, you may have the floor. Please speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. South Africa is pleased to deliver the statement on behalf of the African Group. Africa notes the outcomes of the meeting of the ad hoc technical expert group on invasive alien species and the work undertaken by the Interagency Liaison Group on AIS and by the World Customs Organization to address the risks of living organisms as environmentally hazardous goods in transport and cross-border e-commerce. Indeed, the IAS continue to be among the biggest threats to Africa's biodiversity, and it is noted that anthropogenic changes in the environment add further complexity and increased risk of biological invasion and consequent threat to biodiversity. Furthermore, the effects of other global changes such as climate change, land use change, and land degradation, pollution, unsustainable use are exacerbating the impact of IAS. IAS continue to threaten livelihoods dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services, destroy infrastructure, and impact on human and animal health. Africa knows the elements of guidance developed on the basis of the work of ATEC. Africa is of the view that at this stage, parties cannot be invited to implement the guidance in its current form. The guidance document is complex and requires additional work. Annex 1 does not provide method for cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis to the management and invasive alien species, but rather outlines obligation to parties. Annex 3 needs to be presented with case studies and best practices, and also needs to be implemented in the context of ecosystem-based approach to have greater magnitude of impact. Recognizing that it has been over 25 years since the entry into force of the CBD, there is a need to consider the different assessments done to assess efforts to safeguard Africa's biodiversity from the impacts of IAS to guide the consideration of IAS in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Also, given that IAS are continually changing and new IAS are evolving, there is a need for regular assessment of IAS to inform appropriate mitigation measures. Africa knows that the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has pointed out that there are opportunities for African countries to enhance the conservation of Africa's biodiversity together through the appropriate implementation of the post-2020 GBIF. However, such implementation can only be enhanced through the provision of adequate financial resources, technological and development to enhance skills and capacities for countries to assess the risk and implement adequate mitigation measures. This needs to be considered in the recommendation to the COP. It is worth noting that Africa is of the view that we are inundated with guidance document in this topic, with little or no resource to support their implementation. In addition, there is a need to consider the relationship between anthropogenic changes and their effect on invasive species, thus reaffirming the need for use of horizon scanning and modeling exercise to enhance our risk assessment effort by factoring climate change effects in the management of invasive alien species. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, South Africa. On behalf of the African region, we will now have Mexico, followed by Canada, and then the Russian Federation. Mexico, you have the floor.
Hello.
Yes, you may begin. Thank you.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Mexico welcomes the fact that the World Customs Organization has included IAS in its framework of standards on cross-border e-commerce to strengthen controls at entry points and also international cooperation systems for the exchange of information and traceability. In this context, we also welcome the results of the ATEG on invasive alien species, and we recognize the importance of the generation, collaboration, and use of the initiatives that have already been established. Turning now to the annexes of the draft, we have some specific comments on each one of these annexes. On Annex 1, first of all, we think it's important to strengthen early warning systems for the national detection of invasive species at entry points for goods and people. We agree with standardizing information on invasive species. Mexico has made progress on this matter based on the so-called Plinian Core program, which we could share so that it could be used by other countries. Turning now to Annex 2, we consider that the implementation and use of digital single windows should be implemented at a global scale. However, the physical inspection of shipments and goods should continue. As a result of the development of e-commerce platforms on the internet, the risk of introduction or invasion of IAS has increased. Therefore, countries should establish mechanisms that enable constant monitoring and regular assessments of the policies on oversight and transfer of information. Now, Annex 3. The language needs to be standardized so that it refers to the expression sleeper alien species and not just sleeper species. On Annex 4, we emphasize the need to set up platforms to systematize the data obtained to help with future construction of scenarios as well as decision making. Also, we need to have traceability mechanisms to be set up to enable us to link up the goods moving across borders with the monitoring and control of IAS and GMOs in order to prevent their unintentional introduction or accidental release. Finally, we agree with the development of a globally harmonized labeling system for consignments of environmentally hazardous living organisms. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mexico, we will now have Canada, followed by the Russian Federation, and then New Zealand. Canada, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Le Canada reconnaît le travail fait par la
Chair, Canada recognizes the work done by the ATEG in order to support the management of invasive alien species. It is important to note that these species are a direct vector of threat. We thank the efforts of the Executive Secretary to increase the collaboration in order to deal with invasive alien species and to apply methods of dealing with pathogens that come in with introduced alien species. This problem is that other pathogenic agents can affect all of the world in the future. We recognize the work done on relevant issues of a socioeconomic nature caused by e-commerce of invasive alien species. Data is required. Canada is encouraged by the work done to develop a system of harmonized labeling at the international level in order to deal with consignments of IAS, which are a threat to biodiversity. We believe that this system should be based on databases that are standardized. Canada has a proposal on this issue, and we will provide further details. Canada supplies, in principle, the recommendation of the subsidiary body, as well as those elaborated by the IPCC. We would like for COP15 to provide some ideas on the wording before COP15 occurs. And also we would like to talk about voluntary application of methods, and we will provide these ideas to the Secretary. We would like as well to deal with Annex 5 and its proposals. Canada would also like to deal with prior free informed consent and recognize the Indigenous peoples and local communities' right to be involved in this management. And also we recognize the role of NGOs. Canada would also wish to be involved in the work of the subsidiary body before COP15. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Canada. We will now have the Russian Federation, followed by New Zealand and then Argentina. Russian Federation, the floor is yours.
Уважаемые председатели, участники встречи.
Meeting participants, Russia would like to note the quality, comprehensive review of the issue under discussion on the part of the ATEC on invasive alien species. We would also like to propose the addition of a recommendation to the parties of the convention regarding the creation of national working groups on invasive alien species. This is a time-consuming effort, and we would like to draw your attention to the fact that with the support of national working groups, the ATEC's work could be even more productive. We would like also to say that an ever-growing number of species will be forced to change their habitat by external factors. That said, the climate factor is extremely important here, as it will impact all species, and many surviving species could become invasive alien species. We should not be waging war on the drive of species to survive by changing their habitat in order to survive. We cannot agree with the suggestion to limit ourselves to establishing lists that specify which species may be important and restrict importation of the remainder, as proposed in 1.4 of Annex 2. This may be acceptable to island states, but it will be practically impossible for large countries with a developed economy. In the interest of timely detection and assessment of the threat posed by invasive alien species, as well as prediction of consequences, we propose to develop studies with multi-factor modeling of habitat dynamics, factoring in global climate change. Russia has for many years now been doing research and methods work on cost-benefit analysis and determination of the cost-effectiveness of the fight against invasive alien species. We believe that at this stage, it is worthwhile to publish regular bulletins on the most dangerous invasive species, what we call the top 100. In Russia, such a bulletin was published in 2018, and the English translation will come out in 2020. We propose using national and regional bulletins to compile the top 100 list that present a global threat. This would help us coordinate our actions on a global scale. In conclusion, we would like to underscore the necessity and importance of fostering exchanges between global, regional, and national databases of invasive alien species. In Russia, this work is done by the research institutes of the Academy of Science and the Ministry of Natural Resources agencies. Currently, Russian national databases have been created for a number of groups of AIS, and certain data on AIS in Russia are contained in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, including the spread of these species. Centralized open access to global biodiversity data, including data on the prevalence of AIS, will facilitate modeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Russian Federation. We will now have New Zealand, followed by Argentina and then Norway. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. As one of the IPE's 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss, and as a key managed threat to New Zealand's economic, cultural and environmental well-being, we stress the importance of strengthened international action and cooperation to prevent the spread of invasive alien species. We support strengthening the focus of invasive species within the post-2020 GBIF to build both on AHE Target 9 and on the implementation of the Convention's programs of work to address this cross-cutting issue. Invasive alien species are a particular threat to island ecosystems and have a disproportionate effect on island states, including many of our South Pacific neighbours. New Zealand Government and research organisations are partnering with the Pacific Regional Environment Programme to share knowledge, expertise and build invasive species management capability of Pacific Island countries and territories. On the draft recommendations, we have 3 notes at this time. Firstly, we thank the Secretariat for acknowledging our request to make a minor correction to the annexes to accurately reflect New Zealand's submissions regarding Mātauranga Māori. Next, substitute recommendation paragraph 3 and draft COP decision paragraph 7A tasks the Executive Secretary to submit a proposal on globally harmonised labelling system for consignments of environmentally hazardous living organisms. This appears to be a jump forward from the COP14 decision 11 request to explore with relevant bodies the possibility of developing a system of classification and labelling consistent and in harmony with international agreements. It is not clear from the papers what this exploration entailed and what the views of these other bodies were on the efficacy and the usefulness of taking this next step. We hesitate to support this request of the Executive Secretary without further clarification on this, and while we are happy to discuss this in a formal substance session, at this point we suggest, at the least, we reinsert the line consistent and in harmony with international agreements into both paragraphs, given the likely crossover with mandated international standard-setting bodies that carefully manage the development of trade-related labelling. Finally, we note the ongoing proliferation of voluntary guidance being produced by the CBD on invasive species, including as annexed to this decision. And paragraph 7B now asks for further tools and guidance to be developed, taking into account information in Annex 5. Annex 5 appears to already be guidance, and much of it concerns matters that are led by other international organisations who have produced their own guidance. While we will of course not object to additional guidance sought by other parties, we suggest that we look to carefully streamline efforts and resources to focus on what is most useful for achieving our invasive species targets and goals. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. We will now have Argentina, followed by Norway and then the Dominican Republic. Argentina, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Esta intervención.
We are making this as a preliminary informal statement, and we wish to make the following observations, and we will make more to the future formal meeting. IAS have been identified as one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. This has been pointed out in many international reports, such as the IPBES Global Assessment, and is thus recognised in Argentina's National Biodiversity Strategy. Given this situation, my country has developed and is currently implementing a national IES strategy, which seeks to develop regulatory frameworks and interinstitutional and interjurisdictional arrangements for the prevention, early detection, control, eradication and monitoring of these species. In the light of this experience, Argentina takes note of the documents under consideration and points out that we need to take a biological perspective above all else, given the complexity of this subject and the interlinkages with other international processes, as already mentioned by many other speakers. Argentina calls attention to the reference to criteria based on cultural and social biodiversity values in many sections in the document. And in particular, we wish to highlight that the process of multi-criteria decision-making processes that may be set up, as well as risk assessments to be carried out, should be based all on scientific evidence to avoid regulations based on subjective valuations that are hard to measure and compare. And in the calls to consider ratification of various international agreements, Argentina points out that states can effectively control IAS independently from the international instruments to which they belong as parties. Turning now to the approach to trade laid out in the documents, Argentina recognises that trade acts as a potential entry point for IAS. On this matter, we wish to underscore that international trade is taking place to a large extent and increasingly via electronic means. Therefore, we believe it's appropriate to discuss this in this sphere, and we should base ourselves on the definition of the e-commerce established by the World Customs Organization's work programme on this type of trade, and we need to respect the international standards and obligations that have emerged from the WCO. Madam Chair, we wish to reiterate our willingness to continue working on this agenda item at the in-person meeting of SBSTTA-24. Thank you.
Thank you, Argentina. We will now have Norway, followed by the Dominican Republic, and then Indonesia. Norway, the floor is yours. Norway, we can't hear you. Try again, please. You have the floor. Norway. Norway, we can't hear you. We will go to the next one and then come back to you. So, Dominican Republic. Can you give Dominican Republic the floor, please? Thank you, Dominican Republic. You may begin.
Okay. Good morning. Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Dominican Republic thanks you for the documents that have been submitted. We are an island country, has a high degree of vulnerability because of its island condition, so we believe that we need to really strengthen the references to capacity building and the transfer of technology, which we also need to strengthen 5.2.1, that indicator on early warning systems, and 5.2.1.2 on the adoption of national legislation. Over and above this, we need to have the correct financial resources. Efforts have been made on capacity building and awareness raising, and thanks to the coordination with the WCO and also our national body on IAS and on the introduction of a species. And also we have been giving financial resources to control IAS, but this cannot be considered to be sufficient because of the accelerated rhythm and the increasing trend of this driver of loss of biodiversity. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dominican Republic. So we'll try Norway again. So please give Norway the floor. Norway, you have the floor. Please begin. I'm sorry, we're not hearing you, Norway.
Norway, also please check your settings if your camera and microphone are correctly chosen.
Norway. Okay, we have to try with you again. We will now ask for Indonesia to have the floor, and they will be followed by Japan and France. So Indonesia, you have the floor. You may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Indonesia welcome for the greater attention in managing the invasive alien species globally. Furthermore, to reduce the unnecessary risk of biodiversity loss by invasive alien species, we call to allocate more space for action for mitigating the alien invasive plant and animal species by including but limited to study of the risk and impact, raising awareness, and integrated monitoring. Taking this opportunity, my country, Indonesia, speaking for and on behalf of the Asian member states, welcomes the draft recommendation to COP, which takes note of the outcome of the last ad hoc technical expert group on invasive alien species meeting in December 2019 and support endorsement of the element of guidance on the management of invasive alien species as developed by the ad hoc technical expert group. The Asian region has made significant progress in consolidating ongoing effort in invasive alien species management and in exchanging essential taxonomic information useful for agencies that are managing IAS through the Asian IAS database. An action plan for IAS is being developed based on the result of the baseline study on the IAS management in the Asian region, and this will augment it by other activities such as capacity building, training, and knowledge exchange. Nevertheless, based on the finding and recommendation of the Asian Biodiversity Outlook 2, we call for actions including but not limited to greater, greater global effort to increase awareness and understanding of the impact and implication of IAS, exchange global and regional cooperation on planning, monitoring, and data exchange on invasive alien species, specifically the established early detection and rapid response system, enhance capacity on the management of the IAS, and harmonize multi-criteria decision-making approaches to address gaps in risk assessment methodology, such as through prevention, management, and control of the IAS by relevant authorities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Indonesia. We will now have Japan, followed by France, and then Peru. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. About the exploration, non-classification, and labeling for consignments of living organisms being carried out based on collaboration with relevant organizations, we believe that this is a desirable process for realizing initiatives in a manner that is harmonized with socio-economic activities. We suppose the draft recommendation should be supported as long as no additional budget is expected to be incurred. In addition, Japan proposed to add one note to Annex 5. Japan has been taking measures against fire ants since 2017, and we believe that more emphasis should be placed on international countermeasures against invasive alien species introduced unintentionally in the post-2020 GBIF. Also, Japan has responded to the paragraph 11 of the Decision 13/13, which called for information collection on the movement of IAS attached to sea containers and action to mitigate the risk. Based on our experiences, we believe that it's necessary to keep in mind that invasive alien species such as fire ants can be transferred by sea containers and are not necessarily confined to cargo containing live organisms, but may introduced by any cargo containing non-living organisms such as industrial products. Sorry. Japan.
It looks like we've lost Japan. In the meantime, we will go to Norway and then go back to Japan. Norway, please give Norway the floor. Norway, the
Can you
floor
hear me?
is yours.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you, Chair. So, Norway supports the suggested recommendation for a COP15 decision in Section 2, Para 12 of the document. However, we do see the need for strengthening the language in paragraph 3 of the decision, which concern the potential follow-up on the guidance elements in the document on the national level by parties. So we have a proposal for strengthened and more active wording in paragraph 3, and we will submit our proposal in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Norway. So we'll try Japan again. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Japan emphasizes the need to further strengthen collaboration with the discussion on cleanliness of sea containers in the IPPC. In this regard, we propose to add some sentences on an intentional introduction of IAS via sea containers at the end of the advice on management specific pathways described in Annex 5B. We will submit a proposal in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. We will now have France, followed by Peru, and then China. France, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. France supports Portugal's intervention. We would also like to congratulate the ATEC for its work, and we hope that COP15 will adopt a similar version. In particular, France also believes there is a need to develop information platforms for raising public awareness of these new threats, as detailed in the new Annex 5, to monitor and study the effects on biodiversity and native species resilience of large-scale release of invasive alien species raised in captivity, and to take action accordingly. To monitor the emergence of infectious diseases affecting plant and animal health caused by pathogenic agents. This information should be available in the IUCN's invasive species database to develop monitoring capability in order to prevent the introduction of invasive species by updating digital and training tools, identifying priority zones, and harmonizing information media. The document contains very important proposals, including the need to ensure that e-commerce platforms, e-payment services, and postal services comply with national and international regulations in their operations, particularly where we're talking about living organisms. France also supports taking into account risks that are linked to climate change. Finally, my country shares the ATEC's wish to address social and cultural concerns more explicitly in the definition of the priorities and costs related to the introduction of invasive species. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, France. We will now have Peru, followed by China, and then Uganda. China. Peru, sorry, you have the floor. Peru. Can you please give Peru the floor, please? Thank you. Peru, you may begin.
Okay. Muchas gracias, señora Presidente. Muchas gracias.
Madam Chair. Peru wishes to express its concern because of the increase of consignments with IAS and also changes in trade patterns and consumption habits and also because of anthropogenic changes in the environment, which are increasingly having an impact on things and increasing the complexity and the risk of IAS invasions and the threats that they bring to life and earth. So we need to increase collaboration between the parties and other relevant actors. We thank you for the work and the guidance that has been drawn up by the ATEG. This offers guidance framework for managing IAS. At the same time, we recognise the work that has been done by the Interagency Liaison Group on IAS together with the World Customs Organization. This is key to deal with the risks of living organisms as they're environmentally hazardous when it comes to transport and cross-border e-commerce. Also, it's very good to see that we've included IAS in the technical specifications within the framework of standards for cross-border trade. This will really help us to manage the IAS at a national, regional and local level. We need to work together in a complementary way with the different institutions that are involved in IAS. We need to do this work for the prevention of IAS and the detection thereof. And it's very important for the Executive Secretary to drop this proposal on the globally harmonized labeling system for the environmentally hazardous consignments of living organisms. That will be very useful for management purposes. There's lots of different methods as mentioned in the documents, and there's the cost, benefits and prioritization, which is already being used for the different systems to manage IAS. We consider that it is urgent to have capacity building of the parties for the prevention, control and eradication of IAS, starting with methodologies for prioritization based on science for these IAS, and also an analysis of the impact when it comes to managing these IAS. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Peru. We will now have China, followed by Uganda and the European Union. China, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Thanks to the Secretariat.
We have lost China. We are unable to hear you anymore. So therefore, we will go to Uganda and then come back to you, China. Uganda, can you please give Uganda the floor, please? Uganda, you may start. You have the floor. Thank you. Uganda,
Yes.
please. Thank you. Yes, you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Uganda supports the statement presented by South Africa on behalf of the African group. We welcome the 5 elements of guidance on management of invasive alien species towards achieving the Aichi Biodiversity Target 9. We welcome also the explicit inclusion of diverse social and cultural values of biodiversity across communities at the national level, including those of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth. Uganda also supports the inclusion of a specific target on invasive alien species and supports the proposal on a globally harmonized labeling system for consignments. We suggest that implementation mechanisms are treated as priority and operationalized. This includes specifically capacity building, technology transfer from north to south and south to south, and also provision of adequate resources. Thus, we reaffirm the need for increased collaboration among parties, governments, and other relevant agencies. I submit on behalf of Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Uganda. We will now try China again. Please give China the floor. China, you may begin. Thank you. China. I'm sorry, China, we cannot hear you. We can hear you now. Yes, you have the floor.
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. China thanks the Secretariat and ASTAC for their efforts and contributions to the prevention and control of invasive alien species. China attaches great importance to the prevention and control of invasive alien species and has been actively participating in relevant discussions organized by the Secretariat. Regarding the guidance elements in Annex 1 to 5 of the draft proposal, China supports updating and implementing the relevant content of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan on potential risks caused by invasive alien species. In terms of management measures for invasive alien species, we recommend to strengthen cooperation among international, national, regional, and related organizations to deal with invasion channels, prevention and control technologies, international assistance, and capacity building. China welcomes suggestions on sharing of information and data related to IAS and the development of management priorities for invasive alien species. Finally, we support the inclusion of policies, regulations, and related control measures into monitoring indicators and suggest that the indicator should reflect on the progress made in capacity building, such as awareness raising and education, in order to effectively implement and monitor the post-2020 global biodiversity framework prevention and control targets for alien species invasion. Thank you.
Thank you, China. We will now move to the European Union, followed by Switzerland, and then finally Cuba. European Union, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I speak on behalf of the European Union. Several member states of the European Union have already made interventions, and we support this. So I will only make some additional brief remarks. As regards the suggested recommendation within Section 2, we propose, firstly, to reflect that many elements of the guidance contained in the annexes have been negotiated earlier and that relevant points are already included in several previous COP decisions. Secondly, to redraft it so it corresponds directly to the tasks given in the ad hoc technical expert group's terms of reference in COP decision 14/11. Thirdly, to state that a precautionary approach should be applied regarding the potential use of engineered gene drives for the management of invasive alien species. Lastly, to include a reference to the role of invasive alien species in the transmission of diseases affecting biodiversity or human health. In relation to the annexes, we consider that their content requires substantial revision so that they correspond directly to the tasks given in the ad hoc technical expert group's terms of reference and that consistency is ensured with previous decisions addressing the same or similar topics. We will submit more detailed comments in writing and share them on the webpage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, European Union. We'll now have Switzerland and then the last party, Cuba. Switzerland, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished colleagues,
Switzerland welcomes the explorations of the ad hoc technical expert group as presented in document CBD SBSTTA-24/10. While we welcome several of the recommendations, Switzerland especially welcomes the method for cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis, as well as risk analysis on the potential consequences which best apply to the management of invasive alien species. With regards to invasive alien species control, for the development and release of organisms which are containing engineered gene drive, Switzerland is of the view that it is necessary to rigorously implement the precautionary approach to avoid potentially significant and irreversible effects to biodiversity, and when necessary, to refrain from releasing those when risks and benefits cannot be correctly assessed. These findings, Madam Chair, are preliminary, and Switzerland reserves the right to formulate further elements and comments at the formal SBSTTA-24 meeting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Switzerland. We will now go to the last party, Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor. Please give Cuba the floor. Cuba, can you activate your mic, please? The very top level on the left-hand side. If you press the mic, it's the middle on the left-hand top corner. Please press the mic button. Right. Okay. I don't see them anymore. Cuba, you want to try again, please? Raise your hand. Right. Okay, great. Please give Cuba the floor. Yes, Cuba, you have the floor. Thank you. Please give Cuba the floor. All right, Cuba, you may have the floor now. You can begin.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair. We wish to thank you. So thank you, Madam Chair. We thank you for this new exchange of views on the subject of IES. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? So good afternoon, good evening. We'd like to thank you for this new exchange of views on the subject of IES. Since, as we know, mismanagement, can you hear me now? So thank you for this new exchange of views on the subject of IES. Since, as we know, mismanagement of IES is a relevant factor when it comes to biodiversity loss. That is why our country has regulations on international trade and the management of invasive alien animals and plants to protect the population and the environment from the risks that they cause, as well as minimizing their negative effects and quickly eliminating their possible consequences in terms of pollution, adverse effects, escapes or losses. Here are some of the main difficulties with IES management, namely non-respect of the security conditions laid down in the relevant risk assessments, lack of adequate horizontal relations between the different components in the management chain, such as customs, agricultural authorities and other entities, the fishing industry and environmental regulators, and also insufficient border controls due to a lack of technology to keep up with the current complexity of this phenomenon, and the fact that human resources have limited knowledge of this subject. And also there's a lack of action on education here, which means that development plans are affected and this can cause environmental damage, and then we need to use the limited resources available to remedy these situations. Fortunately, these are aspects that are constantly being improved in our countries. Globally, there is still insufficient linkage between actions and international cooperation to give attention to this subject. So we welcome the effort to set up a globally harmonized labeling system for consignments of environmentally hazardous living organisms, which appears in the current proposed recommendation, as well as assimilation and further consolidation of IAS-related risk assessment systems. There also needs to be better knowledge about possible use of cross-border e-commerce of living organisms that could lead to increased mobility of these species. These are aspects that we believe need to be borne in mind when we're looking at this in the subsidiary bodies and the conference of the parties. And we will put this on the website so that everyone can see our statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Cubo. We have now completed the lists of parties asking for the floor. Unfortunately, we have no more time. Therefore, we are unable to take any interventions from organizations, and I sincerely apologize for that. As previously explained, there will be no conference room papers stemming from the informal sessions. Together with the chair of the subsidiary body, the Secretariat will prepare a short procedural report on the informal session, noting the parties and observers that have made interventions. I thank the chair and my colleagues in the Bureau for giving me the opportunity to chair the session, and I thank you for your cooperation. I will now give the floor back to Ezekiel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. Excellent chairing. We now move to the closure of this informal session. Our time is very limited, so before I close the meeting, I would like Ms. Elizabeth Maroma Mrema, Executive Secretary, to say a few words. You have the floor, Ms. Maroma Mrema.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Delighted. Mr. Chairman, delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In view of the time factor, I just want to sincerely thank our SBSTTA chair, Mr. Ezekiel Benitez, and the entire SBSTTA Bureau, plus my team at the Secretariat for this well-run informal session of the SBSTTA. Of course, sincere thanks to the interpreters, without which we will not have been able to communicate or understand each other. A lot of hard work has gone into the preparation and running of these sessions. There has been many good discussions on the 6 agenda items covered, and parties and various stakeholders actively engaged in each session. Taking the previous information sessions held earlier in the year, plus these informal sessions, I hope we can all be confident that the participants are well versed and better understand the SBSTTA-24 issues under its agenda items and ready to take informed discussions and decisions during the upcoming formal SBSTTA sessions when it convenes. Moving forward, what feels like the end is often the beginning, in that the Secretariat, working closely together with the bureaus, will focus its preparations for the formal session of SBSTTA-24. I trust the same will be for all participants to ensure an effective deliberation when we next meet. Lastly, sincere thanks to you all the participants and all the parties and all participants for joining these sessions and fully engaged by sharing the viewpoints on the agenda items we have had at hand as we prepare for the next formal meeting of SBSTTA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the best to all participants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your closing remarks. I thank you and your team for the hard work over the past 2 weeks. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to close the first informal virtual session of the CBD subsidiary body. We held 6 sessions between 17 to 26 February and covered 6 agenda items. Some 2,000 participants registered, more than 1,100 of whom were from 132 parties and more than 800 from observers. we heard more than 260 statements, including some 200 by parties and more than 60 by observers. This is a great rate of active participation. I'm also pleased that regions were able to come together to prepare prior to this meeting. I regret that today, even you were great in saving time, due to the high demand for the floor, we didn't have the opportunity to hear observers' statements on invasive species and didn't have the opportunity to revisit agenda item 3 as planned. Many lessons learned in order to improve in future virtual sessions. I remind you that the formal meeting of substance we will also address pending agenda items on IPBES and health and biodiversity. Dear colleagues, as this was an informal meeting of substance with no negotiations, there will be no formal substantive outcomes, decisions, or conference room papers. I will work with the Secretariat and sessions chairs to develop and issue the procedural report of the meeting. Bearing in mind that our session was informal, there is an expectation that to increase the efficiency of the formal meeting of SBSTTA-24, parties may refer to their statements at this informal session and only make additions if so needed. As you know, all statements delivered during this informal session were recorded and all written statements were made public on the CBD website, as per indication from the party or observer organization. I would like to thank the Secretary for developing a new and efficient online submission system, which we all now become familiar. I also would like to sincerely thank my colleagues of Substance Bureau for preparing the meeting and for meeting regularly during these 2 weeks, particularly to colleagues who took the main burden of chairing this meeting. Thank you, Marina, Gaute, Mary-May, Adams, and Helena. You were great. I also extend my appreciation to the Executive Secretary and her team for the excellent organization, and especially the team working behind the scenes together with the Interaction team. Many thanks to our interpreters for the hard work. I saw you face difficult times, and of course to all participants despite the different time zones for your dedication, patience, constructive interventions, and mostly staying with the time allocated for interventions. There is no doubt that in spite of the current global limitations due to COVID-19 pandemic, our convention is keeping momentum. Even in this informal format, we heard many serious, constructive, and substantial interventions from parties and key stakeholders in preparation for the formal meeting of SBSTTA-24. I am sure that all contributions will also be useful for the open-ended working group co-chairs, Basil and Francis, in preparing post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I do appreciate your active participation and commitment. I wish you all the very best, stay safe, and see you at the formal meeting later in this year. Have a well-deserved nice weekend. Now, the meeting is closed.